Rachel and Neil from the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures at the University of Sheffield. We'd like you to welcome you to our event, Ocean Health, Modern Day Solutions to the Plastic Pollution Problem. We are very excited to be hosting this event and are very lucky to have secured a panel of expert speakers who collectively have around 100 years of experience within industry, academia and government working at the front line of plastic pollution, action and research. From engineering solutions and policy change to clean-up technologies and world-class scientific research, our panel will discuss the impact of plastic pollution on ocean health and provide modern-day solutions to the plastic pollution problem. The panel will end with a Q&A session where you, as the audience, will be able to ask questions into the chat box and debate the issue of plastic pollution from the perspective of ocean health. And on that note, I will pass over to our chair for today's event, Professor Tony Ryan, OBE, Professor of Physical Chemistry at the University of Sheffield and Founding Director of the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures. Tony, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Lorna, and I'm really pleased to be here. Full disclosure, I'm a polymer chemist, and I've worked in the plastics area and with the plastics industry for getting on for 40 years now. So I bring that experience with me on this journey. So what we're going to do is we've got 4 panel members who will spend around 10 minutes putting their position on this issue, and then we'll have a discussion. What I'll do is I'll introduce them one by one, and then we'll have the discussion towards the end. Please put any questions you might have in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them. So if you see my hands moving around, I'm not reading the Guardian. I'm actually working out how to group the questions together. And the first person who is going to put their position to us is Rowan Byrne. So Rowan's an Irish marine biologist and a technical expert. He leads the plastic project within Mott MacDonald and is responsible for overseeing the group's response to the global plastics crisis and emerging pollutants in aquatic and marine environments. He's a marine biologist and a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology and has 30 years of experience in this area. He's a keen innovator, focuses very much on legacy plastics and how we can and should all work with a range of stakeholders and industry partners and governments to integrate environmental and social considerations into all our activities. He continues to publish on plastic pollution in our waterways and leads on several plastic capture projects across the UK. He won the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment Sustainability Leader of the Year Award in 2020. And early next year, one of Rowan's photos of a leatherback sea turtle hatching will be immortalized on a US postage stamp in support of these endangered species. Rowan, please turtle away.
Anthony, apologies for that. That was a bit of a mouthful. God bless you. Well done. Well, what I'll try and do now is say thank you very much to you guys for having me here today. I'll do my best to keep it short and sweet. I'm not known for my lack of passion and enthusiasm, so I'll do my best to keep it under wraps and within the few minutes. But thank you once again to Harry, yourself, and the team for giving me this opportunity. Right, we'll try and share. Great stuff. We'll try and share my my PowerPoint presentation with you. It's very short. Can you guys see that? Just out of curiosity, if I maximize the screen.
Yes, we can see a screen.
Is that okay? Oh, there's all sorts of stuff going on here on my screen.
Richard arrive as well.
There you go. How is that looking? Because I can't see you now.
Everyone see it now.
Looks great.
Okay. Well, my position here is very much about the ethos of this is about solutions, and there are many solutions to this problem. There are many stakeholders to this who can be involved in solutions, and there's many actions we can take. And one of them, which I've done over the last number of years, which has led me off into other directions to discover other solutions and new avenues, as well as socioeconomics, it is capturing the problem. It's understanding a little bit more about what's in our waterways, what are the emerging pollutants, what are the common pollutants, and what types of plastics and associated non-anthropogenic material we find in these. So one of the things we do was, a couple of years ago, I decided I would get a plankton net, very, very small nanometers in thickness, and I would work with water companies and businesses to put them over outfalls to look at what sort of materials were flowing into our arterial waterways, working their way into the marine environment using freshwater drainage and other sources of pathways. So it's basically a pollution pathway receptor model. It's a fancy way of saying we put nets over pipes. So we put nets over pipes, and we found a number of interesting things. We found anthropogenic materials, from fibers to plastics to different types of metals to different types of plastics and polymers and things like that as well. And we worked with a number of partners to identify these baseline studies. And one of them, which comes to mind, would be the project we did in Milton Keynes. This is just an example of some of the papers and work over the last while. And we found the presence of microfibers, which won't be surprising to you. We found the presence of the different tire particulates and different polymers and plastics. And it's led me to a new baseline. Originally, what we've been looking at here was to literally capture the materials that were working their way into our waterways. Nothing about biodiversity yet, nothing about ecosystem services, nothing about the impacts on the flora and fauna that exist in those environments, and nothing about how it affects us just yet. But the one thing it has led me to discover is that obviously there's different problems in different areas of the environment, in different catchments, in different urban and rural environments. And at the end of the day, we were able to get an idea of what comes out of wastewater treatment works, and also what comes out of drainage and flood alleviation pipeline working their way into, as I said, freshwater environments. But it's also told me a little bit about, I'm very now interested in the epidemiological. So one thing we're doing now in a new project moving forward is exactly the same as what you see here, capturing plastics. But we're going to swab them and see what bacteria is on them. So my idea is very much to find out what type of polymer, what type of plastic, what type of monomer, whatever it is, likes what type of bacterium, and then how it affects ourselves, our human health and public health. So what I'm finding is that the programs that we've done to date from baseline studies have given us ideas of where we can target our solutions, but it's also given us the next steps. We've seen the same with a project I have in Howth, County Dublin, with a sea bin in Ireland. And we've looked at and seen habitat behavioral change in organisms, and a term I call legacy plastics. We found plastics 40, 50 years old coming into the sea bin after being residents in the marine environment. And we've seen organisms growing on these plastics, which don't normally grow on plastics. So we're seeing continuous habitat change being recorded and documented. But essentially, my points are that the first thing that we've done, we've tried to capture the plastic to establish a baseline. Some may say we don't need any more of this information. We've used some of the technology that's available to do that. And I would also infer and agree with Professor Richard Thompson's paper about mechanical cleaning up of marine waterways and its impact on biodiversity, because we found the same, which we'll publish next year. But essentially what we found was we established baselines that have taken us in new directions for new solution-orientated activities, and also understanding more about the socioeconomics behind it. I've tried and leave it there, but there's a wealth of possibilities to look at solutions, because I read a phrase many moons ago that said, before you can manage something, you have to get a measure of it, and I still subscribe to that. There you go. I'm trying to stop sharing, but everything's gone discombobulated.
Perfect. Yeah, you've stopped sharing. And Tony, you're on mute.
Do you know the number of people who would love to be able to put me on mute is a long list. So I just want to say thank you very much, Rowan. And those of you who have questions, please put them in the chat. You'll find the chat in Google Meet. It's the bottom right-hand corner. It's the third button in that looks like a speech bubble, and when you put your marker over it, it says chat with everyone. I want to welcome the unknown, Richard Thompson, who's arrived now, and he's on screen. Richard, we're recording this. I'm hoping you'll be okay with that. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, well, and we're going through, people are doing 10 minutes each around on their position with respect to the subject matter. And our next speaker next panel member is Denise Hardesty. She's a globally recognized scientist and ecologist, focusing her work on plastics pollution, marine monitoring, and surveillance to reduce illegal fishing. Denise's team takes a risk-based approach to addressing plastic impacts on wildlife, people, and economies. Her work also focuses on drivers for litter losses into the environment, how to identify and implement effective policies to reduce plastic entering into the environment, and gear loss from fisheries. She promotes the role of science in underpinning policy and decision-making, and regularly provides science advice to governments and international panels. She believes strongly in the contributions of communities, having worked with more than 8,000 citizen scientists across more than 20 countries to help tackle global challenges, especially plastic pollution. Denise, over to you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I would like to wish you all a very good morning and acknowledge that I am actually at the other end of the day. And I live and work in Western Australia at the moment, and that is Whadjuk Noongar people's country. And so I would actually like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and sea country where I live and work, and to acknowledge their continued custodianship and connection to land and sea country. So that is part of what I think is really important based upon where I live and work, and it's something that I take to heart, and really also want to acknowledge that it is country or land that has never been ceded by the First Nations people within Australia. So what can I tell you about plastic pollution, or what is my position, if you will? I do not have any slides for you. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking. So I am an optimist. I am a scientist, and as was so kindly shared, I have been working in this space for a while, and I really look at the different components as where does plastic that ends up in the environment come from? How does it move through our environment? What is the impact of that plastic or mismanaged waste ending up in the environment on people, communities, and wildlife? And then what are the policy responses, and how are they effective or not? So that we're trying to get at not just what do we see and where do we see it, but what are the underpinning drivers behind it so that you can really create change. I'm guessing this is a fairly knowledgeable audience, and I think we may be aware of a few things. One, plastic pollution is continuing to increase at a rate that is pretty astronomical. We do a very, very poor job around the world of recycling. Recyclable does not mean that items or objects are recycled. You know, we're recycling a very, very small amount, unfortunately. And yet that seems to be quite a focal area around policies, etc. You know, we're seeing that quite broadly internationally. And we tend to, as a global community, focus on where plastic ends up, and we talk about leakage from these particular countries or these regions, but we're failing to acknowledge often that the usage is much, much heavier on a per person basis in our much more developed economies around the world. So I think that's something really worth noting. And I live in one of the top 5 per capita countries for usage. And I am from one of the other top 5 countries for usage, given that I am originally from the US and I live in Australia. I would actually argue that plastic is quite a strong social justice and social equity issue. And I think that really unpacking some of that and some of who and where is impacted is really important, particularly focusing on small island communities and nations. There are also some pretty amazing solutions that are out there, and we can talk about some of those if people are interested in that as well, that are coming from people and communities. And as a global community, we have really failed to take into account the role of the informal sector. So when we go to G7, G10, G20 meetings, we hear about infrastructure needs and investment and those sorts of things, and we often fail to take into account the amazing job that is happening by already marginalized communities around the world. And I think that's really worth a mention. My work has focused on these 4 areas that I mentioned before, and I'm increasingly focusing some efforts also on nets over pipes, so to speak, but actually measuring and quantifying waste in stormwater assets and gross pollutant traps, because in developed countries, much of our waste is pretty well managed, but it goes into these drains, and then it, when there are rainfall events, it goes right back out. And so we're looking at some technology solutions to help support waste management at the front line with the frontline workers. And for me, that's really about thinking about how do we design with a legacy mindset. Whatever our products are, thinking about not just their first use, but what is that kind of longevity period going to look like for the objects and for the materials that we create products out of. My focus tends to be on socially, culturally, environmentally, and economically appropriate place-based solutions, because I find it to be very problematic that we often come in and say to other countries and people and communities, you should do this, when we may be missing some of the fundamental drivers that are behind some of the usage patterns that we see, such as resources, lack of clean sanitation, lack of clean water, and things like that. Hopefully people in this audience are also aware the science isn't always right. People publish things that may not actually be good science sometimes, and it may not always be accurate. So read carefully, read critically. Are we eating a credit card worth of plastic a week, as has been touted in the media? No, we're not. Are there more fish in the ocean than there is plastic, or is there more plastic in the ocean than there are fish? These are some of the misnomers that end up being shared really broadly, and you need to really ask critically, by weight, by count, what's your metric? So, you know, we are also on the brink of a really important and unique time in the world, not just with all the political challenges that we see in many different aspects, but this pending global plastics treaty is a really unique opportunity for change. And it is actually very, very heartening to see the type of support and engagement from different countries coming together, and what that yields and how binding it is will have a huge impact moving forward. I would urge us, I suppose, as a global community to be very, very thoughtful and circumspect about what we may think of as amazing solutions. We hear about bioplastics, we hear about biodegradable, we hear about degradable, we hear about a number of treatment options and opportunities for end-of-life plastics. And I guess I would urge us to potentially have a discussion about, or to consider some of the risks and unintended consequences of some of the technological advances that we may be looking at with the best of intentions. But there are some real risks and challenges to some of those. And I'll pause there and turn it over to the next speaker. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for that very thoughtful contribution. It's great to hear those popular tropes. You know, there's more plastic in the sea than there are fish, being challenged by people who clearly care about the fish in the sea as well as the plastic. So thank you very much indeed for that. Our next speaker is, our next panel member is Stuart McLanaghan. He's a sustainability strategist who's won awards. He has a wealth of executive experience progressing sustainability for major private and public sector organisations, including Seafish, Mustad Fishing, the Francis Crick Institute, and the UK Prime Minister's Cabinet Office, and a number of government departments. He's a track record providing strategic leadership on aspects of environmental social governance, the circular economy, biosourcing, and sustainable resource management. He played a pivotal role in developing BS 8001, the world's first circular economy standard. He's the head of responsible sourcing at Seafish, where he provides leadership across the UK seafood supply chain on sustainability and the circular economy. Stuart provides advice and strategic support to a range of project boards and groups, and a founding member of the DEFRA Sustainability Leadership Group. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Ryan, and good morning. And crikey, that was a lengthy introduction to me. So thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen with you all. Can I just check, Ryan, that you're seeing my first slide?
Yeah, everyone calls me Tony, and I am seeing your first slide.
Brilliant. Apologies. Thanks, Tony. Okay. So firstly, just a very short intro to Seafish. For those that are not aware, we're a public body in the UK. We support the UK seafood industry to thrive. Set up in '81 under the Fisheries Act. DEFRA is our sponsoring department, but we also work with the other devolved administrations across the UK. Our funding primarily comes from a levy on the first sale of seafood products in the UK, and that includes imports. And our 85 staff bring a wide range of fisheries and seafood knowledge and expertise, and we operate from offices in Edinburgh and Grimsby. Firstly, I guess a little bit of context. Sustainable fisheries management is vital, obviously, to protect marine ecosystems, but also to secure fish and sailfish and shellfish even to feed today's and future generations, and to support the protein needs of a growing global population. Whilst we recognise that all food production systems have environmental impacts, working on solutions to keep fishing gear as well as aquaculture equipment out of the marine environment is a part of responsible sourcing and indeed industry social license to operate. Most of you will probably understand the European policy context, although we are obviously no longer part of the EU. Data from beach litter counts, the EU estimated that 85% of marine litter is plastic, of which single-use plastics items represented 50% and fishing-related gear 27% of the total. So perhaps my important first remark is that whilst fishing gear is not single-use by design or in use, when lost in our oceans, obviously can be a challenging problem. I think it's also important to distinguish between end-of-life plastic containing fishing gears that are brought back to shore for responsible management, including repair and recycling, and those that for one reason or another may be abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded in our oceans. Important also to consider where our seafood comes from. The UK seafood supply chain is dominated by imports. Indeed, the value of imports in 2021 was 4.5 times that of fish landed in the UK. In other words, we import most of the seafood we eat, where cod, haddock, salmon, tuna and prawns are the most popular consumed in the UK. So recognising that we're an international supply chain where seafood is one of the most traded commodities globally, Seafish nor the UK fishing sector can alone solve the problem of ocean plastic originating from fishing gear. So this is very much about collaborative partnerships, pre-competitive working, bringing scale and shared resources to address common supply chain challenges. Moving on to some of the specific challenges where fishing gear, I'm focusing primarily on fishing gear, but again, aquaculture equipment is also very important here. Fishing gear presents a challenge in the oceans because it may only survive for several months of heavy use. It can become worn, it can get snagged, it can break apart and potentially sink to the ocean floor. When it's lost or discarded in the oceans, it can unintentionally trap fish and other marine animals, sometimes referred to as ghost fishing. It can also be a hazard for fishing and other vessels and can damage equipment such as propellers. So when old gear is returned to land, it needs to be managed responsibly. Currently, most ports pay to send these items to landfill. Clearly, it would be more sustainable if the materials could be reused, repaired and or recycled into new products. But there are challenges to overcome before this becomes more mainstream. For example, smaller ports don't have suitable storage facilities. Also, gear can be difficult to disassemble for recycling, as it's made up of very many different materials, not all of which are plastic. So finding ways to reuse and recycle materials from fishing gear and aquaculture equipment is an important part towards a circular economy where resources are managed more sustainably, and we are working actively in this space with industry and other partners to find solutions. In terms of some of the main challenges, just very quickly, not proposing to go through the detail of this slide, it's there for reference, but our time and motion studies have again and again shown, be it from pots and creels through to beam trawls, that the cost of gear disassembly, together with the subsequent waste management for the elements that cannot readily be recycled, exceeds the low income received from those recycled materials. The example shown is part of our work with Plymouth University under the Indigo project, where we dismantle 2 different types of lobster pots in the southwest. Again, the information, the detail is there for your subsequent consideration. The summary point here is that the end value of the materials currently, regardless of the type of pot or net, is currently negligible relative to the dismantling and the management costs. Here is a picture of my colleague, Gus Caslake, down in the southwest, explaining the disassembly of a beam trawl in a YouTube video, and I provided a link to this and other resources at the end of my presentation. I'm sure most of you are aware that it's generally estimated that 80% of a product's environmental impact can be controlled at the design stage. So going forward, we increasingly need to design gears with a longer lifespan. They need to be more suitable for reuse and or recycling, and with a minimized risk of being lost, abandoned or discarded before the end of life. And much of the focus currently under the CEN-TC working group 466 and its subcommittees is very much looking at the circularity and recyclability of fishing gears and aquaculture equipment. In terms of infrastructure, another challenge here to delivering a more circular economy for plastics from fishing gear is the lack of UK reprocessing or processing capacity. For several years, Hardesty Innovation in the southwest has been supplying material abroad, primarily to Aquafil in Slovenia and Plastics Global in Denmark. Aquafil, for example, only takes nylon nets, which are chemically recycled into a yarn, which can be used, an econol yarn, which can be used to, for example, manufacture swim gear, running shoes, and carpets. Encouragingly, I'm pleased to say there is increasing interest now in reprocessing single and mixed polymer plastics from end-of-life fishing gear within the UK, including the likes of J&A Young, Berry, and Reef Factory. And Keep Britain Tidy and Millspeed currently claim to be the only fully UK-based trawl net recycling scheme. And of course, it's also important to remember the work of the fishing sector itself, supporting and working with projects, including Fishing for Litter. My other main area before 2 or 3 concluding remarks relates to policy and more to do with policy. I've already mentioned the standards. The UK administrations are very much committed to work with industry to develop solutions in this space. In 2020, Seafish partnered with the 4 devolved administrations to hold a series of workshops very much focusing on this problem, part of which was to provide an opportunity to identify the main challenges and opportunities, identify the main data and knowledge gaps, sort of building baseline understanding, enable the 4 devolved administrations to communicate their latest policy thinking and to share emerging good practice. And quite a lot of that good practice is also embodied in a series of case studies on the Seafish website. These workshops played a formative role in the development of the UK end-of-life fishing gear policy steering group. I think it's fair to say that we really now need to move beyond the challenges at the top of UK government in the interim, major changes at ministerial level, to really get this group rejuvenated and moving forward. There are a range of policy initiatives under consideration by governments, and these are not restricted to extended producer responsibility. Some of these options would not necessarily be mutually exclusive. So, for example, improving waste management facilities at ports would be a common requirement. Very important to recognise that any policy intervention will require the primary producer to be appropriately defined. For example, fishing trawl makers are actually more assemblers for purchase components, and manufacturers of twines using netting and ropes typically don't just produce for fishing, they produce for agriculture, horticulture, and netting for sports fields. We've already heard about the importance of end-to-end supply chain solutions to avoid unintended consequences. And I think it's incredibly important to note there's been a lot of discussion around biodegradable fishing gear. I think it's important to say that any potential substitution of man-made fibres would require as a prerequisite confidence on like-for-like material performance, because obviously on health and safety grounds, fishing gear very often comes under load, especially during retrieval when the weight of the catch would be considerable. And we need to ensure that those gears are safe and would likely be subject to more certification and inspections by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. And final remark there, I think any major accident aboard any fishing vessel would be both entirely unacceptable, and it would be a Hindenburg moment and spell the abrupt end for this option for fishing. Final closing remarks, Chair. So we recognise the seafood sector as part of the problem, but we're also an important part working with partners in developing sustainable solutions. We have an international supply chain, so neither Seafish or the UK sector can solve this problem in isolation. Cost is a key problem, as our time and motion studies have shown. And again, any effective solution needs to be founded on an end-to-end solution.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you very much.
Again, questions have started coming up in the chat now. I just want to remind you, it's the third button in the bottom right-hand corner of your of Google Chat. And Stuart, before we get into the chat, I tried to take a photograph of the inside of my spectacles, but these spectacle frames are made from recycled fishing nets by the chemical recycling of nylon 6. It's really efficient. The fishing nets are about £500 a ton new. Spectacle frames are about £3 million a ton new. So it's absolutely upcycling doing it this way, but I don't think there's enough of a market for spectacle frames to cope with all the fishing nets.
Yeah, and just a very quick response. No disagreement with anything you've outlined there. Much easier to do that if you've got a single polymer, plastic, for example, in a gill net. When you're talking about a beam trawl and you're looking to disassemble that, forget the rubber disc, forget the steel beam. You've got a whole range of different polymers that need to be separated, and some of the ropes are steel reinforced. So we currently have some challenges when you're looking at those more complex gears. Indeed.
So the final panelist is Professor Richard Thompson, OBE FRS. He comes up on your screen as unknown, but he is absolutely well known to all of us here as the person who came up with the term microplastics. I don't know. Is it in the Oxford English Dictionary yet with an attribution to you, Richard?
I don't know. I need to check, Tony. It was word of the year, apparently, in Spain the year before last.
Okay, very good. Well, so he's a professor of marine biology and director of the Marine Institute at the University of Plymouth. He's a world-leading marine scientist at the forefront of research into the causes and effects of marine litter. He founds and heads the university's International Marine Litter Research Unit, which has charted the global distribution of microplastics from Arctic sea ice to the deep seas. In 2019, the university was awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for the pioneering research of Richard and his colleagues on marine microplastics pollution and its impact on the environment and changing behaviour. Over to you, sir.
Tony, can I just check you can see my slides okay?
Well, we can see your slides fine.
Okay.
Thank you very much, yeah. And
So-
the first one's horrible.
Okay, I mean, that's one of the field sites I'm working in, and you're right, it is horrible. I want to talk really a little bit about solutions, and of course, there's no single solutions, but we've touched on it already, that there is what I would call a once in a planet opportunity that emerges from the UN treaty to address plastics pollution. I've just returned from those discussions in Nairobi for INC3. And I guess I wanted to reflect a little bit on elements of the treaty that I think are going to be quite important to guiding us towards solutions. I think it goes without saying that, but sometimes there's a shortcut here that people talk about plastic and plastic litter as if it's one thing. I mean, it's the most heterogeneous, the most diverse form of environmental contamination that I've come across as a marine scientist. And that here you just see the shapes and sizes from everything from bits so big you can see them from satellites in space to right down at the nano end, pieces that actually defy our ability to pull them back from an environmental sample and confirm exactly what we've got in the first place. And that's just the shapes and sizes. If we add on the chemical complexity, the thousands of different chemical additives that are incorporated into different polymers, we've got an incredibly diverse range of materials and also impacts, but also causes and then possible solutions. So it's what you might call a wicked problem. It presents harm in a range of different ways. And there is clear evidence of economic harm, harm to human health and well-being, and harm to humans. I think it's really important, though, that we take, when we're thinking about harm, we take a hazards-based approach rather than trying to devise a risk assessment for every different type of plastic that might find its way into the environment. And I'll illustrate that with one plastic bottle here. I mean, that whole plastic bottle presents a challenge to human well-being. We've shown that litter on beaches it depresses, if you like, what the psychologists call the restorative value of the natural environment. It presents an economic harm in loss of tourist revenue. As it breaks down into smaller bits, it's clear that there's harm to wildlife, possibly ecosystem services. And as it breaks down even further, some of the work in my lab's shown that when it gets down to a nanoparticle size, it's got the potential to pass from the gut to the circulatory system here of a mollusk and to travel throughout all the tissues in that mollusk's body within a matter of a few hours. But if you look underneath each of these pictures, the point I'm trying to make is the type of harm, the type of risk is different. And so it's really quite challenging to come up with a kind of a risk-based approach. And I think we need to move to a position where we're considering all of this material in the environment is potentially hazardous, and the direction of travel is to drive it down rather than getting bogged down in the details of is one kind of plastic more or less harmful than another. We should be working to drive down its accumulation in the environment. I think it's really important that we take a sectoral approach. We just heard an excellent presentation about the fishing industry, but the challenges and the opportunities in the fishing industry are very different, let's say, to those in agriculture or those that emanate from transport, as you see in the bottom left. Most people tend to think about marine litter as the sort of thing I've got up at the top left, that litter on a pavement making its way into the oceans. But that's quite different to the fishing gear we've just heard about, to transport. It's also different to F, which was kind of my starting image. Here we're moving to the bottom right-hand side. This isn't litter, this is mismanaged waste. It's waste that's been collected by households, but then there's no management system to deal with it. And then you could also look at the pathways that I've got at the bottom in the middle, for example, via wastewater treatment. So we need to think of a sector-based approach when we're starting to move towards solutions. There's no one size fits all, and we've got to consider it by sector. I think it's really key, and Rowan touched on this, that we move to interventions that are upstream. This is a piece of work that Rowan mentioned from my lab, published recently, showing what is captured by a cleanup device on the left. What you get after a couple of days when you empty it is mostly seaweed. That's the picture on the blue tarpaulin, plus a few fish, which are mostly dead, and a fairly small quantity of plastic that you see on the far right-hand side. The amount of plastic collected after several days of continuous running was less than the one lemonade bottle that I illustrated in my previous slide by weight, and we're catching about one marine creature for every 3 bits of litter that you pull out. So we really need to think about where best to intervene and make sure we've got the evidence to guide us around these interventions. I think that the role of science is going to be critical in all of this. And so I think it's going to be critical that the treaty is informed via science policy interface. Here are just some of the questions where I think science is going to be important. And you've touched on some of those already, and I'm sure we'll come back to them when we reach the discussion stage. I'll finish with just one example of why the science, I think, is going to be important to guide us to the right place. I'll talk to textile fiber pollution. It's something Tony and I tried to get some funding for a few years ago, but were unsuccessful. It's one of the major sources of microplastics to the environment, the fibers coming from our clothing. We see interventions coming via wastewater and via washing machines with suggestions of filters and wastewater treatment. But there's also more systemic interventions via garment design. We've shown that actually half of all the emissions to the environment are coming while you're wearing the clothes, not while you're washing them. So those interventions in the middle of the screen that I'm going to highlight in yellow now, the national, what I call things that are fixable by national policy. So the French are mandating filters, and others are suggesting we need to improve wastewater treatment. Those are potential interventions at a national policy level, but let's not forget that most of the planet doesn't have the benefit of a washing machine or wastewater treatment. And even if we implement those, we're only going to catch half the emissions because the other half are coming while you wear them. And yet we've already got clear evidence that if we had international guidelines around better design of textiles and fabrics, we could probably reduce emissions by about 80%. And so it's the need, I think, for the treaty to recognise and differentiate between national level actions and where we really need international policy to guide the way forward. So I'm going to stop there and say I think it's important that we consider a hazard-based approach as we try to drive down plastics in the environment. We need sector-specific strategies and work programs. We need to focus those upstream, and I think we're going to need independent science that's not conflicted, if you like, by conflicts of interest arising from financial or other types of income to those scientists. So thanks very much, and I'll stop sharing there. Thank you.
Well, so thank you to all 3 of our panel members. They all come from the same position but different perspectives, I would say, and it's going to be interesting to see how the discussion progresses. We've had some questions in the chat already. I just want to check, can everyone turn their microphone on?
Yes, they should be able to.
Okay, Harry. So Benedict J. Smith, you were in first. Do you want to ask your question? I'm assuming he's here. I know he knows how to use everything.
He might not be able to use the microphone, so it might be better to just read.
Yeah, I also know he was in the pub till late as well. I doubt that has anything to do with it though, Ben. So Ben said, So can the financial burden of remediation lie on historic polluters in the same vein as loss and damage? And he also says, when production is exported, who's held responsible? Is it the producer of the plastic or the person who causes the litter of the plastic? So whoever wants to take that first. I see Denise has turned the microphone on already.
Oh, okay, I'll start and then others can add maybe. So when production is exported, who is held responsible? Right now, there's quite a strong ask or request for what people tend to call EPR, which is extended producer responsibility, although there's an increasing focus on calling that actually PR, which is actually the producer's responsibility. Where does it typically sit? It typically sits with fines, if anything, to those that lose the litter, so to the individual consumer, much more strongly than with the producers or manufacturers or distributors in the current world. And there's quite a shift or a request or a requirement desire to see that burden shifted. So, and who can the financial burden of remediation lie on historic polluters in the same vein as loss and damage? The answer, I guess, in some ways might be sure, and yet on the other hand, how? Is it going to be proportionate based upon production, or is it going to be proportionate based upon brand audits, which actually may relate more to brand recognition than to actual percentage or proportionate of loss to the environment? So these are really good questions and very thorny. One of my bugbears, I have to admit, is trying to seek or request that we build reverse logistics so that we build those transportation costs and requirements to the producers, manufacturers, distributors, so that those costs and consequences don't get stuck where the product is actually sold potentially, but rather sits further up the supply chain. Would others like to chime in and add to that?
Well, panel members, Richard seems keen to have a go.
I'm happy to. I agree completely that there needs to be a greater responsibility taken by producers to see this problem off. And I think to some extent, producers maybe have had their head in the sand. I remember a meeting in the UK organized by RAP about 8 years ago when they announced 8 problematic items in the UK, problematic to dispose of. And there was a little bit of pushback from the industry about how much of a challenge, they were getting recently. And I asked them the question, I said, who in the industry that came in this morning didn't know that those 8 items were potentially problematic? These were things like multi-layers, for example. And they all said, well, of course we've known they're problematic. We've known for a long time. And you could say the same. Well, I was reaching for some props while Denise was talking. This is a PET bottle. It's potentially highly recyclable, but somebody's contaminated it with green coloring, which reduces the economic value of it in recycling by about 50%. So there are challenges with recycling, but some of those have come from poor design. It was interesting to me a decade ago, the Japanese had realized this and taken the colorings out of their products, but we were quite slow in the UK and elsewhere in the world to follow. So I think that to me, there's a really clear responsibility, and it's clear, even with a polymer we've known for decades is highly recyclable, we're doing a really abysmal job of designing it for circularity. And so when people say we can't recycle our way out of here, I agree, we can't, but we're doing a pretty poor job of even trying. And the only person that can fix that is the producer, right? And so that front and center, I'm not saying the whole problem is fixed by the producer. Of course, we need to respond as citizens right along the supply chain. But as an individual, I can't hope to achieve it. I put my recycling waste bin out separated this morning. I can't achieve it if the industry doesn't design a product that's compatible with some kind of end of life.
So Stuart's got his hand up. So any comes?
Thank you. And yeah, I very much agree with the sentiments that my fellow panelists have made. You know, we really have got to move the needle forward and quite quickly where the design for circularity is concerned. I think one of the big challenges here through the lens of fishing gear is, as I alluded to in the presentation, actually defining who the producer is, particularly if you're going to put a policy intervention in place, an EPR or PR, and I'm not saying for one moment the UK government or the devolved administrations will necessarily follow the EU implementation route. But I think it would be naive to assume that the producer, if we could define the producer accurately, wouldn't then look to pass those costs down the supply chain. I think it would be very naive. And it sounds such a simple off-the-cuff comment to say we need to look at mechanisms to incentivize the supply chain to do the right thing. But whether it's us as householders or industry operating commercially, we've got to turn much greater attention in that direction.
Rowan, do you have a view on this? Yeah, clearly.
Yeah, I agree with my fellow panelists, but it's just really Stuart always gave me the perfect lead into it. He said incentivize supply chain. I was about to say, is there any way we can flip this? Is there any way we can provide opportunities for people to make money, for consumers to return things and get a few cents back? Is there any way that we can flip it to be positive? Let's be honest, there's a legacy here that's going to be hard to break. Even human dogma is so difficult. But if there's one thing that people like, they like to have a few bob in their pocket. So if you can put a few bob in their pocket, they'll actually cooperate. And whether it's green incentives or whatever you want to do. But if somebody can say, even young children, when I was a child, I used to collect golf balls on a golf course from 5 to 15 years of age, and I'd make a few bob selling 5 for £1 to the golfers. But that's the incentive you want to tap into. So I would try and maybe flip the financial burden into the financial opportunity and incentivize it in some ways. It doesn't always work. We see examples with Iceland at the supermarket. We see examples in different European countries about returning bottles and all that sort of stuff. But you know, I'm going to show my age here now. I used to return Coca-Cola bottles and glass bottles to get a quarter pound of sweets. Do you know what I mean? Like, so there must be some way we can not reinvent the wheel, but as Richard indicates with design, get people incentivized to profit, if that's the right word, but also let the environment profit. So I would try and flip it, but I do agree with my fellow panelists.
So there's.
I might just add one little point to that. So we do know that incentives work, and they can be quite small to have people respond well. We know that buyback schemes, low-cost loans, those sorts of things also work within fishing communities to get, you know, as long as there are the waste receptacles, to get end-of-life gear to be returned back to those areas. And I think that if you want to have incentives work, Rowan, I absolutely concur with that. At the same time, if we have international standards and requirements such that beverage manufacturers are no longer legally permitted to produce PET bottles in multiple colors, which we're starting to see in places, then we simplify the supply chains, we increase the material recovery, which supports the systems that are already built in place, so that we can increase that circularity and, you know, provide those economic benefits both up and down the supply chains. And we know those things work. That's been demonstrated in multiple countries around the world. So just to further that. Sorry, Tony, back to you.
No, so I am going to take the chair's prerogative here. So I work in the plastic circular economy and have done so for quite some time. And in our plastic circular economy research, we have behavioral psychologists, we have linguists, as well as scientists and engineers. And I've been following UNEP. And one of the issues I'm really, really frightened of is that a plastic circular economy costs more in pounds, shillings, and pence. If our metric is money, then a circular economy of plastic is far more expensive than a linear economy of plastic. And
that's if you ignore the externalities, sure.
sorry, and
but you've got to build it.
and the externalities are ignored by money. Money does ignore the externalities. Okay, therefore, those costs, the costs of accounting for the externalities, are then paid for by the users of plastic. So the use of plastic will be more expensive in cash terms, even if you're getting money back to go buy sweeties, right? And that burden will be borne by the people who can least afford it, i.e. the people that use plastic to prevent food waste, yeah, to make their lives livable. So I am really concerned that we could end up driving social injustice by dealing with plastic waste in a way that prevents the beneficial use of plastic and adds costs to its use.
Anthony, may I just say, I know Denise wants to get in there. I'm just going to compliment Denise from the point of view of the externalities, and I get exactly where you're coming from financial and monetary perspective, Anthony, and cost per unit effort. I understand that, but the one thing that you can't put a price on is the feel-good factor, is the enthusiasm that grows from doing the right thing, the cumulative impact of that. And then, of course, the first question, and I agree with your analysis, but the first question that came to mind was, what's the cost to the environment? And what you can't put a monetary cost on that, and ecosystem and biodiversity. But I get your point.
No,
there's a lot to it.
Absolutely, absolutely, completely and utterly. You can't put a price on the externalities, and therein lies the problem.
Yes, that's a fair point. It's
but
a difficult
you can put a cost on it if you cannot afford clean drinking water and food to eat, then you are hard pressed to be focused on the feel-good factor.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that. And yet to be honest, I think that's a little bit of, I mean, we've been hearing that argument from the plastics industry for the last several decades.
Okay.
And so, that's nothing new. It's, it's the same thing of plastic bags are so much more environmentally friendly than paper bags. And I think that is a failure to acknowledge the full cost. And I don't care if you're not interested in the environment.
No, I am very interested.
Okay, but I'm saying this is a topic that's relevant to each and every one of us, whether you're an environmentalist or you care about the turtles or the clean environment, whether you care about making money. If you could make that same argument about why organic food is more expensive, and it's a false argument, because as soon as you have the infrastructure in the shifts, you see healthy systems, healthy economic systems. I'm not talking about environmental systems. Those are improved as an ancillary benefit, if you will, but it's a short-sighted argument that fails to consider what happens when we do choose as a global community to invest in the longer term rather than the immediate short term. Richard, I'm guessing we're not at odds here.
Your microphone's not on, Richard.
You're on mute.
I echo exactly what you said, Denise. And I think here, Tony, we're at risk of mixing together two different challenges. I mean, everything costs, right? And those that have got less money will be less able to buy those goods and services. But that is absolutely not an excuse to continue contaminating the planet with millions of tons. I'm not saying you're advocating that. I'm just saying we've got to separate those two things. And moving to a more sustainable model of using plastics and designing them in a way that's more compatible with the environment will cost more, at least in the first instance. Maybe we'll see economies of scale, but I think we've got to accept that cost and deal with addressing inequalities as if I say a secondary issue, I don't mean a less important issue, but the linear system for producing plastics isn't a justification for something to do with fixing inequalities. So let's pull those things apart. I know, but I heard it last week from many in the plastics industry. You know, it's exactly the argument they put, Tony. I'm not criticizing you, but I think we've got to stop mixing these things up.
Okay, so Edwin Johnson, who should be online and available, he has a question about successful international policies. Edwin, are you here? Are you able to ask your question?
Yeah, floating around. What was my question?
The question was, have any international policies been successfully implemented and upheld regarding the environment?
Yeah, that's it.
So over to you, panel.
I mean, one of the go-to examples is to look at propellants in aerosol cans, to look at CFCs, for example. You could also look perhaps to, you know, regeneration of populations of marine mammals related to bans on whaling. I mean, there are examples, but it's hard, right? It's you know, it's challenging. It's challenging for me to get an agreement amongst 5 academics, let alone 180 nations worldwide. But it's not to say we shouldn't try, and it's not to say that there haven't been successes.
Ed's come back with his hand up now.
Sorry, perhaps a better way of asking that question is what made those successful?
Can I just say, I'll wrap it up in one word, what made it successful? It was the will.
Yeah,
That was it. It was the will to do it. And as Richard has alluded to, the Montreal Protocol in the mid to late 1990s about CFCs, etc., everybody got together and there was a will to do it. And they did it. And then the ozone layer was happy and everybody was grand. But my point being that there was a will. So I hear continually well-minded, passionate individuals from all sectors talking about doing action. But is there a will to do it, and a quick will to do it, to get it delivered fast? So in actual fact, it's about will. But we have proven we can do it. So and even then, since we've got a bit more better technology and a bit more better common sense, so have we got the will to do it? That's where I would come from.
And it was will with legislation.
Yeah.
So it needed to be legally binding. So it's great to have the will, and with that, an instrument is incredibly important and valuable. And that is why we are at the precipice of a very unique opportunity in the plastic space. In quite, I mean, you could say in a very long time frame, or frankly, quite a short time frame, you know, since the awareness and like with the awareness that's been raised.
So there's a couple of other questions in the chat. So let's go to something a little less contentious, perhaps, and a bit more practical. So Harry Watt, if you're there, can you turn your mic on and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm here. I was just had a question for what are the best actions a layperson can do in order to reduce microplastics or improve the ocean health?
Don't litter.
Well, reduce your purchase, buy less plastic stuff, and influence within your sphere. You know, yes, wear natural fibers, and you know, and buy secondhand, and you know, all those shop local, bring your own cup. There are literally hundreds of things, and if you want some really great ideas, and I'll put it in the chat bar, look up plasticfreejuly.org. They have ideas for the day, the week, the month, the year for individuals, communities, businesses, governments, etc. And they're really smart, simple, tangible things that are suggested there. Richard, you were going to add.
I would agree with that. And we all should ask ourselves the question, how can I manage my own plastic footprint? What can I do to reduce it? What am I doing that's increasing it? And who else is doing this? What cooperatives or community or neighbours, whoever I could join? And there's a number of well-published avenues to do that. But I think that it sounds a bit romantic, but there was an expression. The Chinese have an old expression: a journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. So if we all started the first step, just by cutting down, removing plastic, buying less, whatever it is, but just reducing our quantities that we use and utilize. And then we all cumulatively do that together, then we're starting to have an impact. So it is about what you can do, depending on the money in your pocket. Everybody doesn't have the same opportunities in those regards, but there's always something you can do to reduce. That would be the way I think of it.
So just to for the panel's benefit more than anything else, So the Grantham Centre has kind of two strap lines. One is enough for everyone, and the other is reducing global consumption. So we're on board with all of that. If there are other suggestions from the floor for Harry, then by all means put them in the chat. It'd be nice to get a compendium. I think that the one thing I would say is you absolutely don't need 2 stainless steel water bottles. So make sure that whatever you do to reduce your plastics use isn't actually producing more greenhouse gas emissions somewhere else. And sometimes the best use, the best way, if you want a water bottle, the best thing to do is to actually pick up, wash and reuse a PET bottle that somebody else has left behind. So Alicia has a question around, well, she got a direct reply about turtles, and she has some questions around getting things returned. Alicia, are you there?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I was just a bit curious. In the beginning, I think with Rowan, he mentioned about working with leatherbacks. And generally, I work a lot with the reproductive biology of turtles and tortoises. And I'm just curious, in this space, have we seen more impacts that maybe I haven't learned by myself on the reproductive biology and potential of probably sea turtles, since this is more ocean based? So thanks.
Happy to answer, Rita. Sorry, I'm being attacked by my dog here, which isn't very helpful. Would you go away, you? Yes, I did work with sea turtles for many years and still do, and leatherbacks are just phenomenal. But the one thing I'll come back to about plastic and leatherbacks, I did do some research on satellite tracking of leatherbacks and et cetera. But I remember in the early 1990s when I was getting involved as a young career scientist with sea turtles. Sorry, would you stop? Sorry, this is crazy. I remember reading a paper that when leatherbacks would eat plastics, not only is there not a lot of damage to them, the chemicals from some of the plastic bags or the plastic material they would eat would be transferred into the shell of the developing sea turtle hatchling. So what you'll find is that over time that there will be a transference in the pathway. But yes, I that was one of the key things that struck me many years ago in the early 1990s, but and has grown since then. And I've also seen many evidence areas where leatherbacks have ingested plastic bags and died the most horrendous death because they can't dive, they can't reproduce, they can't metabolize, they can't feed, and they just float on the surface getting burnt by the sun, et cetera as well. So sorry, a bit of a rant, but there is a very strong connection there from ingestion and transference to different biological membranes and then passed on to the offspring and impacts.
So they have seen a maternal transfer.
How soon could they transfer? It's a good question. I'd have to refer back to the paper, but given that a leatherback would migrate from Canada into the Caribbean and would be on the offshore areas of the Caribbean for about maybe 3 months, I would imagine the migration between the whole thing would be about 9 months with the migration and return. So I would imagine you're looking at probably quickly within 6 months, if not 3 months in the nesting period, given that the continuous cycle of deposition of eggs is every 12 days and the system is ticking over. So any nutrients out of there is transferred into the egg cases that are deposited every 12 days, up to 10 times in one season.
Yes. You had another set of questions around returning waste for incentives, small profits to return things. Do you want to follow up with that?
Yes, I think that was just more of like a point of discussion more than maybe a question, because from my home country, you do get like a small little profit when you return like plastic bottles, for instance. But just from my own experience, seeing other people, like there will be people who are not willing to do that, even though there is a small return because of the amount of effort you need to maybe return this plastic bottle. So for example, where you need to return this bottle is so inaccessible for some people. We don't all have cars, for example. So for somebody to go out of their way, take 2 or 3 buses to return these plastic bottles, there is an effort that you need to put in to do that people may not see as very rewarding, to just get a few cents when maybe you've spent 5 times more to just get there by bus, for example.
Okay. Any commentary panel wise?
I think one of the things. Go ahead, Denise, if you want. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so what we find is that in lower socioeconomic areas, people tend to return materials for the economic benefit. And in higher socioeconomic areas, they tend to have more curbside services and things like that. So again, but what we see in those same areas is that there are often centers like containers for change or things like that, so that the profits from or the incentive for those items end up being collected and then returned back to needier areas in the community in some countries. You know, we also find more mismanaged waste in areas that don't have as high of socioeconomic status. You know, and in wealthier areas, we see that more of the containers, there's less litter on the ground, where people have education opportunities, job opportunities, all those sorts of things, which kind of highlights, I suppose, more, you know, again, some of that social inequity and social justice. Part of that is around some of the infrastructure that's put into place. And in countries or communities where we don't have actual incentives, PET, for example, still does have intrinsic value, unlike some of the other plastic polymer types. And so we do see higher material recovery, you know, for those items that are more intrinsically valuable as well.
Yeah.
Rowan, back to you though. I know you wanted to
And
add something.
Stuart had his hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks. Just a few remarks from me here. I mean, I think one of the things that I still struggle to get my head around at times is that, if I understand the statistics correctly, there are over 10,000 chemicals currently in the global plastic supply chain. So there is, you know, an urgent need in terms of that redesign and that re-engineering to both reduce complexity and toxicity where those chemicals are concerned. Of course, the big challenge we have there will also be with the legacy materials, and there are massive quantities of those in circulation. Much of that is finding its way into the environment. We need to make recycling, and, you know, recycling isn't a panacea, as my fellow colleagues have said, easier for consumers. You know, in the UK, and I'm not saying that this is a global issue, but in the UK, for example, local authority recycling bins are different shapes, sizes, colours. They collect different materials. You almost need a sort of a postgraduate qualification at times to decide what goes in one bin and what goes in the other. You know, somewhat flippantly, we need to make that easier for consumers. You know, wouldn't it be wonderful if it had a green dot on it and you knew it went in the recycling bin, a red dot, it went into the general refuge. And the other thing, I think local authorities are missing a massive trick here. It's generally known that they get more complaints about missed waste collections than anything else, rather than the fire service, the police. Why is that? Because it's the most visual service that everybody sees, with a bin or bins outside of their household every week or fortnight, depending on the collection types. I think local authorities are missing, on average, a massive opportunity in terms of the communication of good practice, about the increase in recycling rates, and as part of that feel good factor, getting people to do the right thing. hiding those statistics, quite frankly, in industry articles and government websites in annual league tables is not the way to do that.
Can I just say that I think there's two words I would use here, which would be which would reflect on what I think is the way forward. Alicia, you mentioned it, effort. It takes a lot of effort, and consumers probably don't have the effort or do have the effort, etc. But I think the one thing that's always worked for me is co-location, tapping into where consumers go the most and making it easier for them. I know TerraCycle tried to do this a number of years ago and did something similar, but I've always found that if you go to one location that can co-locate some of your activities, whether it's dropping off clothes for recycling to the British Heart Foundation when you go to Tesco's in the car park, or getting your car washed while you're doing your shopping. I always find that if there's these sort of things, then it supports the effort and reduces the effort at the same time. So co-location has its benefits both in biology and sociology. But for me anyway, if I can go to one place to do the majority of things and do something good, and it's all in one place, that works too as well. So effort to me is about co-location.
Mic back on. I want to share this with you. So this piece of plastic, yeah, it's biaxially oriented polypropylene. You think it has a value of a fiver?
I would say no, and I'll give you one small example, Anthony.
Hang on. This piece of plastic is exactly the same material, and it has a value of nothing. No one wants it, right? There is our problem. How do we give the collection of this material value in the same way you could leave? Well, if I dropped one of these, it picked up really, really quickly. If I drop one of these, no one's going to pick it up for a long time. Richard, he's seen that gag before, so he has a prepared answer for it.
I have seen the gag before, but I mean, it's to your point, I think, Alessia, that, and it goes back to the discussion with Tony earlier on, where we were saying, you know, the refund that you're getting on that piece of plastic is not related to the true cost of it staying in the environment, and that's why we will need you know, policies and financial instruments that sit beyond just the commercial value of the plastics in a recycling stream in order to get this to work. You know, in where I am in the UK, I had a lorry come to pick up the recycling this morning. That cost money that I'm paying in my local authority fees. In another country, you might not have that lorry come, but we need investment in that country to make the collection infrastructure work in a different way. So you're talking about bringing it on a bus and taking it. Well, maybe that means you've got to be incentivized to a greater extent. You know, we need to recognize in this the true cost of leaving it in the environment, rather than actually the commercial value of Tony's fiver versus the other piece of plastic that he just held up. And we need instruments in place to get that to work so that it makes sense, that the effort makes sense. But ultimately, I would say, when I talk to the psychologists I work with, we can't put a reward on every piece of plastic. You know, the change, it needs to start from design, but the changes in behavior we want need to almost be as automatic, let's say, as if I see a hot tap running in the bathroom, I turn it off because I immediately recognize a waste, and I know how to intervene by turning the tap off. And I also know that my intervention will be successful. So ultimately, we can't reward or punish all of these behaviors, but we will need some financial instruments that actually link to the true value of plastic rather than its value in a recycling stream in order to help us on the way.
And Tony, can you just confirm for me that plastic polymer notes are food grade plastic?
They're not, sorry, they're not food grade plastic.
I was just because I'm like, the food wrapper versus a polymer note. Are those? I mean,
no. So they are exactly the same base polymer. It's polypropylene. It's biaxially oriented polypropylene. The plastic notes were initially developed in Australia. They were the first to have plastic currency. And you could recycle one into the other. I think that
they're also not single-use plastic, which is another one of those profound differences in terms of what ends up in our waste stream and lost to the environment.
Well, no plastic needs to be single use. I think the number of uses, right? You know, the fibre gets passed from person to person to person to person is a social construct in the same way that the difference between those two materials is a social construct. And this question, from my perspective, is about people more than it's about plastic, right? We could be discussing other waste materials, other misuse of materials, but it's a behavioural problem, right? So if I went to the Rugby World Cup, and I brought one of these back, this cost me €2 to bring back as a souvenir. There were none left on the floor because they were worth €2. You could get the €2 back. But every PET bottle that people had bought water in was on the floor because there was no perceived value to it. So I understand the issue around how we can't give the economic value to every piece of plastic, but we must incentivize in some way, whether it's financial or otherwise, the prevention of leakage, because it's leakage that's the issue, right? I think we would all agree with that.
Wait, so I agree with that, and it's production. We need to reduce and shift our relationship with plastic. So to say it's only a social issue puts all of the weight and responsibility back onto individuals who may not have another option. And so, yeah, you can make that claim in the UK or the United States or Australia, but let's go to where the world's populations live, where they don't have the resources, they don't have the infrastructure. And to say that, oh, it's just a social behavioral problem, I'm sorry, like respectfully, Tony, I can't concur with that one. I just can't.
So, okay.
If we don't reduce production, you know, all the facilities and infrastructure in the world, like there's still going to be some leakage. And I think, again, that's a fallacy that shortchanges us as individuals, as a community, as scientists, as citizens, and of our responsibilities.
And to some extent, Tony, you've also just proved that it isn't a social problem. It's an economic problem. It's a problem associated with the value of the two objects you've just held up, and you've reinforced that with your cup that's come back from the World Cup. You know, so it is about the economies of plastic that cause certain behaviours. It's not about humans behaving badly, and they've been calling out the culprit here for too long.
I clearly didn't express this very well. Clearly one could live in a society with no plastic. Okay, we didn't have plastic a century ago, so it clearly can be done. Okay, if we do it now, then it will be very easy to do in the global north, in the wealthy countries, and very difficult to do in those countries that don't have the wealth that allow you to take on the extra burden.
It's interesting. I actually would flip that on its head, which is why this is a great debate of ideas, because I would argue the opposite. It is those of us who are privileged, who are all on this call, on our computers, on our phones, on all these devices. You know, we all have, you know, half of us have glasses, you know, all these sorts of things. We are stuck with the luxuries. The, you know, necessity is the mother of invention is where we're seeing people still wrap things in banana leaves, where they aren't using shoes in single-use plastics, where they're actually shopping and growing locally within their community. So I would actually, I don't share the view that it's so easy for us in the Western developed countries to reduce and to be without plastic. We're the heaviest consumers on a per capita basis. Where people don't have the socioeconomic opportunities, that they're forced to buy sachets, which again is a false economy that industry is doing for our betterment, which is blatantly false and creates more profit for them. You know, those are the communities where people can and do make do and use far less plastic than we do. So, you know, let's acknowledge that, please.
Yeah, you're on mute. I just want to say, and I know points are. This is a great discussion. I just say plastic is part of our sustainable future, and it gives us so many benefits. It's amazing. It's just how we bloody abused it and don't use it right. But it's part of our future. And I know, Anthony, you weren't suggesting that. You were saying in the past this is what we did, and you can't go back there. But times have changed, and it's really important to acknowledge that. I will say one thing, just to go back to your fiver, Anthony, if it's okay. I know we're going to run out of time, like in 2 seconds. But the one thing I'd like to point out about plastic money, and I have proof of this, is that the polymer coating breaks down. So I've collectively called it like money pollutes. You can play on the word as much as you want. But the idea being that I found money in a wastewater treatment works in Newmarket in East Anglia in the south of England that was washed down as part of the treatment works. And when we were doing the study of the plastics, we were finding money. And then I thought to myself, I looked at the money and it was fragmented and broken up and dog-eared and all that sort of stuff. So I thought, not only is plastic money polluting, it is polluting through fragmentation and degradation. Anyway, but it was just, that was the point I wanted to make. But I realized you want to put yourself off mute there, Anthony, but we're all good.
Final words, Richard, Stuart.
I think we've covered it, you know, really well. And I think ultimately it's about finding the true cost of plastics and making sure we design them better, because it's all very well pointing the finger. Well, every conversation I've been in this for 20 years, it's always been somebody that's not in the room that's the source of the problem. And I think we can solve it by working together, but we've got to design plastics with end of life in mind to use them more responsibly. We've got to use less.
Agreed. Stuart?
Yeah, I certainly concur with those comments. I mean, I think apart from climate change, plastics in the environment is probably the biggest global market failure environmentally. And I think we've heard a lot today around the need to incentivize both consumers and supply chains in terms of doing the right thing. I think one of the things that we're all agreeing here is that the economics and the economic signals far too often are not in the right place at the right time to facilitate that, and we get all of the perverse behaviours that we do. I get really frustrated the amount of times I go walking in the Lake District or in North Yorkshire. People have carried those beer cans and those bottles and those sandwich packaging full to wherever they're going to enjoy them, but they just don't seem to be able to, when they're a fraction of that weight, to then take them back and responsibly put those into bins. So why am I saying that? The final point is, education is also increasingly important here.
And Britta, last but certainly not least.
I guess I just might build on those comments. I certainly concur and agree. I really appreciate the robustness of the discussion. And I think that remembering context matters, where our social, economic, environmental drivers lie, and just returning to the notion of designing with a legacy mindset and incorporating, the actual costs and not shoving the externalities outside and failing to consider those in our systems for the whole of the plastics life cycle. And we absolutely benefit from plastic. It's the relationship that we currently have that's problematic. Thank you so much.
And I just want to say that that was more or less the abstract of the last grant proposal I wrote around the circular economy. So I'm sure we would find lots to agree about. Luana, you're keen to wrap things up?
Hopefully you can hear me okay. That's brilliant. Thank you all. I want to personally thank you all on behalf of the rest of the panel. It's been obviously a long time in the making this, so I really appreciate you all sticking with us with all the rearranged dates. But yep, on behalf of the rest of the panel and the Grantham Institute and the University of Sheffield, I will draw it to a close. Thank you for everyone that's attended today and for being such wonderful participants in the discussion. It's a touchy subject and a lot of people have opinions on it, but it's really interesting. And thank you all for sharing that in such a respectful way. So I will close that. Thank you very much and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and evening.